I never thought I'd watch the Monroe Doctrine die from a UN Security Council chair. But last month, staring at satellite images of Russian destroyers anchored in Venezuelan waters, I realized something terrifying. 200 years of American hemispheric dominance had just ended, and we did it to ourselves. Those weren't just ships in the Caribbean. They were tombstones marking the death of everything I'd spent my diplomatic career defending. Let me tell you what really happened in that closed Security Council meeting when Putin's ambassador smiled and announced Russia's naval cooperation exercises with Venezuela. The room went silent, not the kind of silence that comes before debate. The kind that comes before a funeral. Because sitting in that chair representing American interests, I knew we'd just witnessed the execution of the Monroe Doctrine. And the weapon wasn't Russian missiles, it was our own sanctions. 3 weeks earlier, I'd received a classified briefing that made my blood run cold. Intelligence reports showed advanced Russian anti-ship missile systems being positioned along Venezuela's coastline. Not defensive weapons, ship killers. Hypersonic cruise missiles capable of tracking and destroying every American naval vessel within 400 miles of the Caribbean. But here's what the Pentagon briefing didn't tell you. Here's what they buried in classified footnotes that I had to fight to see. These missiles weren't there to threaten us randomly. They were there because we'd spent 15 years pushing Venezuela into Russia's arms through the most brutal economic siege in modern history. Every sanction we imposed, every asset we froze, every bank we pressured to cut ties with Caracas drove them deeper into Moscow's embrace. I remember the exact moment I understood how catastrophically we'd miscalculated. It was during a private dinner with European ambassadors in 2019. The French representative leaned over and whispered something that still haunts me. Nikki, you're not isolating Venezuela. You're integrating them into an anti-American alliance. He was right, but Washington wasn't listening. The story begins in 1999 when Hugo Chavez committed what our foreign policy establishment considered an unforgivable sin. He decided Venezuela's oil wealth should serve Venezuelans instead of American corporations. Massive social programs, free healthcare, education investments. He was redirecting petroleum revenues away from foreign shareholders and toward his own people. From that moment, Chavez became a target, not because he was a dictator. We've supported far worse. Not because he threatened American citizens. He never did. But because he challenged the fundamental assumption that Latin America exists to serve North American economic interests. I wasn't in government then, but I studied every diplomatic cable, every policy memo. The pattern was always the same. First diplomatic pressure, then economic restrictions. When that failed, we backed a coup in 2002. It collapsed within 48 hours, but it marked a turning point. From then on, the relationship between Washington and Caracas descended into open economic warfare. By the time I reached the UN in 2017, our Venezuela strategy had crystallized into something John Bolton would later describe with characteristic bluntness: make the economy scream. The goal wasn't regime change through democratic pressure. It was regime change through starvation. We cut Venezuela off from international financial markets. We blocked oil exports. We froze billions in state assets. We pressured European banks to refuse transactions. We made it nearly impossible for Venezuela to import food, medicine, or industrial equipment. The human cost was staggering. Venezuela's economy contracted by over 75%. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines. Children went hungry. Millions fled the country. But here's what nobody talks about in Washington. The government didn't fall. Instead, our pressure achieved something we never intended. It proved to the world that economic dependence on America is a national security threat. During my time at the UN, I watched this lesson spread like wildfire. Every ambassador from every developing nation was taking notes. If Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, could be strangled economically, what chance did smaller nations have? That's when Putin made his move. And I have to admit, it was brilliant. While we were applying maximum pressure, Russia was offering maximum support. Russian oil companies invested billions in Venezuela's energy sector. Technical advisors arrived to help maintain production under sanctions. Military specialists followed with advanced training and equipment. But the real game changer came in 2018. I was in a closed Security Council session when Russia's ambassador casually mentioned defensive naval cooperation with Venezuela. Everyone assumed it was propaganda. I knew better. Intelligence reports crossing my desk showed Russian frigates making increasingly frequent visits to Venezuelan ports. Each time they stayed longer, each time they brought more sophisticated equipment. What started as symbolic gestures of solidarity became operational military partnerships. The moment I'll never forget was March 2019. I was reviewing satellite imagery when I saw something that made me call an emergency briefing. Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers had landed in Venezuela, nuclear-capable aircraft 1,200 miles from Miami. When I brought this to the National Security Council, the response was predictable. More sanctions, more pressure, more threats. Nobody wanted to address the obvious question. How had we allowed Russia to establish a military foothold in our hemisphere? The answer was uncomfortable. We'd created the conditions that made Russian protection necessary for Venezuelan survival. Think about it from Caracas's perspective. American sanctions had cut them off from Western financial systems. European banks wouldn't touch Venezuelan transactions. U.S. threats had scared away traditional trading partners. Russia offered something invaluable, an alternative. Russian energy companies that wouldn't bow to American pressure, Chinese banks that used different financial systems, Iranian technical expertise in sanctions evasion. Together, they created an ecosystem where survival was possible without American approval. We weren't just sanctioning Venezuela, we were forcing them to build the very anti-American alliance we claim to fear. The most chilling moment came during a private conversation with Russia's UN ambassador. It was after a particularly tense Security Council session about Venezuelan humanitarian aid. He pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. Ambassador Haley, you Americans have a saying, if you can't beat them, join them. We prefer, if you won't let us join you, we'll beat you. I thought he was posturing. I was wrong. The intelligence reports I saw in my final months at the UN told a story that terrified me. Russian military advisors weren't just visiting Venezuela, they were building permanent installations, air defense networks, communication systems, and yes, anti-ship missile batteries capable of threatening every American naval vessel in the Caribbean. But here's what kept me awake at night. These weren't offensive weapons positioned to attack America. They were defensive systems designed to ensure that American military intervention in Venezuela would be prohibitively costly. Putin had learned the lesson of Libya. When Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program and tried to normalize relations with the West, we overthrew him anyway. Putin wasn't going to let the same thing happen to his Venezuelan allies. The Russian message was elegant in its simplicity. If NATO could place missile systems on Russia's borders, why couldn't Russia place missile systems near America's? If Ukraine could host Western weapons aimed at Moscow, why couldn't Venezuela host Russian weapons aimed at Miami? The symmetry was perfect. The logic was unassailable, and the timing was devastating. By the time those Russian warships arrived in Venezuelan waters last month, they weren't just conducting naval exercises. They were announcing the end of the Monroe Doctrine. They were declaring that America's exclusive hemisphere no longer existed. Standing in the Security Council chambers, watching Putin's ambassador explain these routine defensive measures, I realized something profound. We weren't witnessing Russian aggression. We were watching the consequences of our own strategic failures. For 30 years after the Cold War, we'd assumed American dominance was permanent. We'd treated other nations' sovereignty as optional when it conflicted with our interests. We'd weaponize the global financial system to punish anyone who challenged our preferences. But power is always temporary, and empires that forget this truth don't just decline, they create the conditions for their own overthrow. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. After the Soviet collapse, we had a historic opportunity to build a cooperative international system. Instead, we chose dominance. We could have integrated Russia into global institutions. We could have partnered with Latin America instead of trying to control it. But hubris is addictive, and for 3 decades, we've been high on the drug of unipolar power. Now we're sobering up, and the hangover is brutal. Those Russian missiles in Venezuela aren't just weapons. They're mirrors, reflecting back 30 years of American choices, every expansion of NATO eastward, every economic sanction that failed to produce regime change, every military intervention that created more enemies than friends. The Monroe Doctrine proclaimed in 1823 that the Western Hemisphere belonged to America. For 2 centuries, that assumption held. But doctrines only work when you have the power to enforce them. And that power, I've learned, is always relative. Today, sitting in my office looking at intelligence photos of Russian destroyers in Venezuelan waters, I'm struck by a devastating irony. We spent so much energy trying to prevent the emergence of peer competitors that we created them ourselves. Every nation we sanctioned became a potential ally for our rivals. Every country we threatened found reasons to build alternative partnerships. Every economy we tried to strangle discovered that survival was possible without American approval. The network that emerged, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, wasn't born from shared ideology. It was born from shared experience. They'd all been targeted by American coercion. Their cooperation was a survival strategy. And now that network has advanced weapons positioned 200 miles from American shores. The question isn't whether America saw this coming. Intelligence reports warned about growing Russian-Venezuelan military cooperation for years. The question is why we forced it to happen, because that's exactly what we did. Through 15 years of economic warfare, we pushed Venezuela into the arms of our greatest rival. Through decades of expansion and intervention, we convinced other nations that American partnership meant American domination. The Russian warships in Venezuelan waters aren't an invasion. They're a response. They're Putin's answer to a simple question. If America can project power anywhere in the world, why can't Russia do the same? The age of unchallenged American hemispheric dominance is over, and we ended it ourselves. Standing at this crossroads, America faces a choice. We can continue down the path of confrontation and coercion, treating every challenge as an affront to be crushed. Or we can choose wisdom over pride, engagement over isolation, cooperation over domination. The Russian missiles in Venezuelan waters are waiting for our answer, and the clock is ticking.